going to be fine. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. I am McKenna Jordan. I'm the owner of Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas, and I'm very excited to be joined tonight by Judithe Little and Cindy Burnett. How are you two tonight?
I'm good, thanks.
Yeah, same here. We're glad to be here.
Great. So, Cindy, I know that you are going to be our guest interviewer, so what I'm going to do is get you two both introduced, and then I'm going to duck away. If there are any questions, please put them in the comments. We'll be monitoring both Facebook and YouTube comments. Actually, technically on YouTube, it's in the chat, and we'll get to those later on. I'll leave it to Cindy and Judy to talk, though, for the first half. So, Judithe Little is the award-winning author of Wycliffe Hall. She earned a BA in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia and a law degree from the University of Virginia School of Law. She grew up in Virginia and now lives with her husband, 3 teenagers, and 3 dogs in Houston, Texas. She is here tonight to talk about her fabulous new novel, The Chanel Sisters. There it is. Thank you, Cindy. So Cindy currently works part-time at Murder by the Book here in Houston. She regularly speaks to book clubs and women's groups about her favorite reads and book suggestions. She's a voracious reader and book reviewer who administers a Bookstagram account, Thoughts from a Page, where she talks about all things book-related. She also shares her thoughts in her weekly Page Turners column in the Buzz magazines and elsewhere. In addition to reading, Cindy loves theater, art, movies, national parks, travel, and hiking in Colorado, which, oh boy, I miss Colorado right now.
For sure.
Okay, well, I'm going to sit back and enjoy the conversation and be checking out the comments and questions, have those ready for later. You guys have a great time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, hello, Judy. How are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Well, I'm thrilled to pieces that we're getting to talk about the Chanel sisters.
Me too.
Why don't we start out by you just talking a little bit about it? Just give us kind of the quick summary for those that haven't read it yet.
Okay, well, the Chanel sisters is historical fiction. And a lot of people, there have been a lot of books written about Coco Chanel, which I think we all know that. But the part what's different about this novel is that it's told from the point of view of Coco's younger sister, Antoinette. And I think most people don't know that Coco had a younger sister. And they also don't know, I didn't know, that she came from poverty. And after her mother died, she and her sisters were abandoned by their father in a convent orphanage and raised as charity cases. And so this is the earlier part of their lives from the convent and then on to how they kind of rose up out of poverty and tried to find a path to get out of poverty, and ultimately started a hat shop on the Rue Cambon in Paris. And then that turned into Chanel as we know it today. The novel ends in 1921, so it's not all of Coco's life, but it's the kind of the beginning. It ends when she starts to get famous.
So how did you decide to tell their story?
I just thought that I was just really intrigued by the fact that Coco had a sister. I didn't know a lot about her, and I think like all of us, she just seems like this iconic figure, always so glamorous and poised and with her pearls, and like she knew from the beginning exactly what she wanted to do and who she was going to be, and everything worked out perfectly for her. And of course, it was really the opposite. And so I wanted to tell that story. And I was really intrigued by what it would have been like to have been her sister. I don't have any sisters. I just have 2 brothers. So I've kind of always wondered what it would be like to have a sister. And so when I found out that Coco had a younger sister, then I was even more intrigued. Like, well, what would it be like to have Coco as a sister? And so I just kind of went from there. I started researching her a little bit before I decided to even write about it. But I just kind of had this feeling that there was a story there. How could you be Coco Chanel's sister and there not be something to tell, right? It seemed that there was.
Well, I liked how you told it from Antoinette's perspective. I thought that worked so well. And as you said, I didn't know she had a sister either. And I bet you hear that from people a lot.
Yeah, I think there's just so much about Coco that there's so many biographies that have been written about her. And there's just so much. I mean, she had such a dense life that there, you know, none of the biographers really focused on Antoinette or on Coco's family at all. Because I mean, they had their hands full with just Coco. So I spent some time really digging into what I could find out about Antoinette. And it was interesting too, that another reason to have her as a narrator is because, you know, Coco lied about her past, which I think a lot of people don't know that either, but she never told the truth about her upbringing and that she was raised in a convent by nuns, and particularly that her father had abandoned her. She really didn't want anybody to know that. So she lied until she died. She never told the truth about that. And it's funny because in my research, I was reading, I tried to read sort of memoirs of people who knew her and who were around her at the time. And there was this one memoir of a woman who worked for Vogue, for US Vogue, but she was stationed in Paris. And Coco had invited her to her summer home. And in her memoir, she talks about how Coco was telling everybody there who was there for the weekend about, you know, the aunts who raised her and the horses she rode, which was all a lie. So it was just funny to read this woman's memoir talking about that, which, you know, she thought was the truth, but it wasn't. So Antoinette, in the novel at least, is an authentic narrator. You know, she knows the lies, and so she can tell us, the reader, you know, the truth.
Right. And she lived through it all with her. Were you surprised to find some of the things from the orphanage ended up in her work later on, like the interlocking C's and the black and white? I mean, did all of that surprise you?
Oh, yes. You know, I had no idea. I mean, I always knew Coco Chanel, black and white, and the interlocking C's, but it's funny because it's almost like she did it on purpose. You know, there's so much, if you look at it now and knowing her past, it's almost like she put these clues in plain sight for everybody to see, but she never told the truth. So, you know, her big, you know, she loved black and white. She really loved those kind of nubby peasant-like fabrics. I mean, she had the wealthy people in Paris wearing the fabrics of peasants during World War I, when the expensive furs were impossible to get. She had people wearing rabbit fur that was something, you know, they never would have worn, and paying, you know, astronomical amounts for it. She designed jewelry that was patterned after the mosaics and the stones of the pathways at the convent orphanage. And then, as you kind of mentioned, the interlocking C's of her logo is actually a pattern that can be seen in the stained glass of the convent orphanage. And so a lot of her biographers think that it originates, the interlocking C's originate from that orphanage, which is so ironic because we think of it as the ultimate in luxury and sophistication, and it's, you know, actually from her orphan childhood.
I do. I think that is very ironic. And she probably was laughing on the inside with that and the rabbit and the jersey and some of those materials that she ended up having people wearing that they would have never worn if she weren't designing their clothes.
Yeah, during World War I, she, you know, and material was hard to come by. And so someone had a bunch of jersey available, but nobody wanted jersey because it was considered cheap and it was used for men's underthings. But she bought it all and made it popular, and made it, one reason was because it was comfortable. And so up until World War I, women were still wearing corsets and they really couldn't move around easily. And one thing she wanted was to be able to move and have freedom. And so most of her designs were just to pare down, make much more simple, almost like the nuns, you know, get rid of all the frou-frou that was so popular before the war, the gigantic hats that, I mean, I can't even imagine wearing one of those hats. But how would you balance that on your head? They were huge. They had, you know, flowers and fruit and bird cages, and they had to have hairpins stuck in their heads just to walk. I mean, being a woman must have been hard back then, just to even move around.
No, I agree. And I think that's why she came up with the idea of the boater, right? And she wore pants long before a lot of women did, right?
She did. I think it's interesting because I think another part of her style and how she came to be was because she was so poor and she didn't have the money for all of the fancy things. She didn't have the money for all the accessories and all the silk and satin and lace trims that everybody else had. And at one point, she was living as a mistress with a man, Etienne Balsan. And this was way before she ever had any idea that she would make clothes for anybody. And they were living, he was a horse breeder, and they were living at his horse farm, which was in the country. There weren't really any stores or anything. And she would take his clothes and wear those. And she discovered, wow, these are all Well, another thing she was big on was pockets too. Like she was the first to put pockets for women in clothing, which when you think about it, I mean, I kind of wish we had more pockets now, really, because it's still kind of a pain to carry a purse around. But yeah, so he taught her to ride horses, and she went to a tailor in the village where his horse farm was, and had instructed the tailor to make her a full riding outfit like a man's, only to fit her. And the tailor says, he didn't want to do that, but she insisted. And so he did. And of course, it was a lot easier to ride horses in a pair of pants than it was in a huge skirt.
Oh, absolutely. And then what was your research like for them? I mean, what was it like trying to research, particularly Antoinette, who you don't hear very much about?
Yeah, so there isn't the information about Antoinette is, kind of scattered about. There's some things that are, we're certain about, that we know that happened, that there's a record of. And then there's some periods in time of her life that there's not much information. And part of that is because Coco lied and she didn't tell the truth, and she didn't keep letters. She destroyed everything. She didn't keep a diary. And so there was nothing on Coco's side, not much about Antoinette. But there is some information that the biographers know. And for instance, she signed the ledger book in 1910 on the Rue Cambon, or sorry, not on the Rue Cambon, but Coco started selling hats out of her lover's apartment first, before she had her shop on the Rue Cambon. And so Antoinette signed the ledger book there. So that's an example of, okay, she was there for sure. But I spent a lot of time, first of all, my first strategy was just to try to figure out where she was during her lifetime. And so I searched a lot of the French census records, which are online, thankfully, but they're scans. So they're actually in French and in handwriting. And you can't search, Antoinette Chanel and have something pop up. You actually have to read through them and then kind of guess, well, maybe she was in this city or this city. But it did help. And I figured out she was in Vichy at one point. And it's just really interesting. I mean, the old handwriting is so elegant, and the names of people, and it talks about their occupations and everything. So it really kind of puts you in the time period. I looked at old newspapers from the time, thinking that I would find information about, Coco Chanel, wouldn't she be in the newspapers? Well, it turns out she wasn't, because she wasn't famous. And she was also a tradeswoman, and, only society was in the newspapers at the time. But I did find some references to Antoinette in a section of the newspaper that was a notice section, which I couldn't figure out for a long time what it was for, but it would, it was very small, just a few lines, and it would talk about people who were traveling, where they were going, what city in France they were going to be in, and her name kept popping up in it. And I finally realized that that was her notifying customers of Chanel where she was going to be, so that her clients would know where she was going to be, and they could, consult her, because they relied on her, and she was a really big part of Coco's business, which I think is something that hadn't really been discussed before, the role she played in helping Coco actually get her start.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. I also was in touch with some of her family members, distant family members, who gave me a lot of good information about one part of her life. And I even found an old book online about how to make hats back in that time, to try to figure out how, what you actually did to make a hat.
So are you a big hat maker now?
No.
Well, I think it's interesting too, because Coco wasn't really too much of a businesswoman, right? So Antoinette was probably handling more of the business type work, and it sounds like traveling around, and she didn't really like dealing with the customers all that much, did she?
No, Coco did not. Evidently, she did not like dealing with the customers. She felt awkward. She really thought of hats as a hobby at first. She didn't think of it as a way for her to make money. And so she felt guilty asking her friends to pay money for a hat, because her friends were women who were in the theater, who were also mistresses that she encountered on this horse farm. But they really liked her hats and they wanted some, and it ended up turning into a business. But so, yeah, Antoinette was kind of the face in the beginning of Chanel, and she would wear, just like Coco, she would wear Coco's styles around, out and about for people to see. And she ran the ledger book. She was a vendeuse. There's a funny story about Coco. So yeah, she didn't know a lot about business. And so her second lover, after Etienne, there was kind of a little bit of a love triangle for a little while with a man called Boy Capel, who was really the love of her life. And he financed her and financed the shop on the Rue Cambon in the beginning. And she got a line of credit with the bank, and she would just go and spend it. And there's a story about her. They went to dinner and they're walking down the street, and she said to him, it's just so easy to make money. I can't believe how easy it is to make money. And he laughed and said, that's not your money. That's the bank's money. I've guaranteed you. They're just giving you their money on my guarantee. And supposedly she was so angry that, she threw her purse at him and ran home, and because she had no idea. She thought all that money was money that she had made. And from that day forward, she was determined to not owe him anything or owe anybody anything, and really tried to tighten the reins of the business, and ultimately ended up paying him back everything that he had fronted her from the beginning.
To get it started. Well, she had no training in any of that. So I'm sure it was hard for her to kind of get started and understand how it was all going to work.
Yeah, I mean, she didn't understand how, I think, banking worked and all that kind of thing. So, but she learned.
Absolutely. Did you have a highlight of writing the book?
I think just learning about Antoinette and discovering who she was, and discovering also how much of the convent is incorporated into Coco Chanel's styles. Even the Chanel suit that we all think of today is kind of like a uniform. She grew up wearing a convent uniform, and she's turned that into something fashionable. So a lot of that, I still discover things even now. Just how much the convent meant to her, but that she would never admit it. And the later in life, she built, this is outside the time period of the book, but she built her vacation home and modeled a lot of it after the convent. So only she knew, she copied the staircase out of the main staircase in the convent, and there were some archways that she copied, and then she had it was very not Parisian at all. It was she would serve food at a buffet table, and it was just not fancy. She was one of the first to use natural landscaping instead of like a topiary garden. She planted lavender and olive trees, which at the time was unusual, but it was the kind of thing that she had at her convent orphanage. So that was a highlight. And also just realizing how much the abandonment by her father really affected her for the rest of her life. I think that kind of drove everything she did for the rest of her life. There were two things. She was always searching to be loved, really. And she was also searching to be independent, because her parents weren't married when she was born. And the father always kind of ran off and had to be dragged back. And the mother was always chasing after him. Finally, her family forced him into marrying her, because I think at the time you could send someone to jail for getting a woman pregnant and not marrying her. And so he married her, but then he still wandered off all the time. And she ended up, there were 5 children altogether, the 3 girls and 2 boys. And the mother ended up dying when she was just 32, 33. And so Coco literally saw that depending on someone else can kill you, that, you can only rely on yourself. And that was kind of a driving force in her life from that time on.
No, it definitely seemed that her father's abandonment drove a lot of what she did, and she struggled with relationships a lot of her life. And I thought that was really interesting. And I also thought the part that I really thought was interesting was how when they were after the convent orphanage, when they were at the kind of boarding school, the pensionnat or whatever it's called, and they would alter their clothes. I thought that was so interesting that she did that from such an early age.
Well, at the convent orphanage in Aubazine, everybody there was basically poor. So they all wore, to my knowledge, they all wore the same uniform. And then when they were older, they got moved to a pensionnat in Moulins, which was a bigger city. It was a city compared to where they were. They were out in the country. And a pensionnat is like a school where you have basically nuns and their boarders. But at the pensionnat, there were charity cases, and then there were the girls from the wealthy families. And of course, Coco and her sister and her Aunt Adrienne, who's also a part of the story, but her Aunt Adrienne is just a year older than Coco, so she was really more like a sister too. They are forced to dress as the charity cases. And so they're wearing, hand-me-downs that don't really fit them, and they wear these wool capes, but the rich girls are like cashmere, and Coco's just like this wool. So that was the first time she really saw that you are, how you dress is who you are. And of course she was like, this isn't me, but it was forced upon her. So the ill-fitting clothes, Coco had a reputation for having insisting on the fit of clothing. Like, she was very precise about the fit. She, especially around the shoulders, she was always very picky about how the shoulders fit women. And so she, in the book, which is fictional, but, my interpretation is that she would have fixed those uniforms so that they might have been bad quality, but they fit those girls. They learned to sew from the nuns, so that was something they did, and that's how she learned to be such a good seamstress.
And so particular about the fit. I just thought that tied in so well. I really liked that. Well, tell me about the gorgeous cover. I'm such a cover person, and for anyone who would like to see the cover. So tell me about that and how it came about, because it's just beautiful.
Well, the cover was done by the art department at my publisher, and I think they did a great job. I love it. I think I was allowed to have a say if I wanted one, but they sent it and I was like, it looks great. I couldn't come up with anything better. So I think it looks good. I think it looks great, actually, and really love the cover. But I can't claim any credit.
Well, I remember talking about the colors a little bit, like whether you liked, was it like the red lettering or black lettering or something like that?
Yeah, I think they were asking me, do you like the black or the red? And
right.
Both look
I don't know. Whatever
Yeah.
looks good. But what do you think the best thing about being a writer is? Like, when you think about everything you've accomplished and, on your second book, what's your favorite thing about being a writer?
I think my favorite thing about being a writer is actually writing. I started out writing really as an escape from, I think, reality. Just, everybody has their stress reliever, whatever it is you do to relieve stress. And I wish mine was running marathons, but instead it's writing. And so I started writing when my kids were really little. They're not little anymore, but it was really an escape from the toddler world and from a world where, you could tell someone to do something and they would completely ignore you, although they still do that. But they would ignore you in a nonsensical kind of way, like, stop sticking the fork in the outlet, you're going to electrocute yourself, and then they keep doing it. So I could, go into writing, which is where I had some control over characters and what they did, and they had to listen to me. And, that's kind of, it's really still the same now, where just whenever something's going on in my life or the world. You know, a lot of times I'm like, oh, I just can't wait to start. I just need to start writing. I just need to escape into my world that I've created. And I think that's, you know, really, it's just kind of a place I can go to for just kind of tranquility in a way.
So you've been writing like crazy for the last 9 months, right?
Well, no, unfortunately, I haven't. I've been too busy with other things, but I'm dying to. Like, I really am. Like, I think, you know, when I'm on edge, I'm kind of like, I think I just need to go write. I think I'll feel better if I can, you know, sit down and write for a little while. But yeah.
Well, are you working on anything at the present? I mean, I know this book has just launched out into the world, but do you have anything you're working on for next time?
I am. Yeah, so, you know, when a book gets published, it takes a long time before there's a long period of time when it's done before it gets published. So in that time period, I've started working on a third book, but I'm still in process, and it's gotten a little bit delayed with having to do stuff for the release of this book, which is great. But yeah, so it's historical fiction again, and it's not from Coco's point of view, but she's in it, and it takes place in the 1930s and 1940s in Paris, which is really fun to learn about that time period. I really didn't. I mean, it's the same like the Chanel sisters takes place. Part of it is World War I, and I knew nothing about World War I when I wrote this. So you know, it's fun to me to research and learn about time periods that I didn't know about, and so this time I'm having fun learning about the 1920s and the 1930s, which are really interesting decades, especially in Paris.
Yes, absolutely. And so many people were in Paris in that time period, the 20s, the 30s, into the World War II. So that has to be a very interesting time period.
It is. I mean, you have the crazy 20s, you know, when everybody was just having parties constantly and drinking, and there were drugs, you know, everybody was on opium and all kinds of stuff. And then you have the 1930s with the Depression, and everything changed. And so, yeah, they're two very different decades, but they're both really interesting decades.
Well, I think it's interesting because as we've gone through this pandemic and people talk so much about the 1918 flu and how, you know, that pandemic, and then coming out of that, there was the Jazz Age, and it makes you understand how things were just so happy, and, you know, everybody was just like, hallelujah. I mean, I wonder if we'll go through something similar, if we can get outside of this and get on the other side, if everybody will just be like, woohoo.
I wondered that myself too. Like, are we about to have a roaring 20s, or
exactly.
Who knows what's going to happen, right? But yeah, I mean, the 1918 flu too. It's interesting because there's no references to that at all in Coco's biographies. Like, it didn't seem to affect them at all, like it has affected us, which is kind of curious to me. So, but evidently it didn't stop her. I mean, they clearly didn't shut down their businesses or quarantine or anything like that. But it was really World War I was so terrible that I think by the time that was over, they were definitely ready to party. And
yeah. Well, I also think that their pandemic got overshadowed by the end of World War I, you know, because they were still kind of at the tail end of World War I, all of that began. And so they probably just kind of dragged into each other a little bit too. I
think they did. And I think that a lot of the soldiers died from the Spanish flu, because they were already, you know, in a weakened state. And but yeah, it's not quite documented as much as World War I is.
No, I agree. Well, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
You know, I've thought about that. There's so much advice, but I think right at the moment, my current advice would be to just have fun. You know, like, writing is, if you're doing it, it's supposed to be fun. And just try to have fun, you know, don't get anxious, don't overthink it. Just remember that you're doing it because you enjoy it. And if you enjoy it, I think the rest will come.
No, I think that's right. And the other thing I hear people say a lot is just get something down. Like, don't worry about it being perfect when you first do it, but instead, you know, start writing and then realizing you'll just have to edit as you go. You know what I mean? Like, get it down and then you can edit. It doesn't have to be perfect initially.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that is really hard. That's hard for me. That's hard for everybody, you know, just, you want it to come out flowing, but if you just have to get ugly words on the page, and fact, I don't know, did you read Pam Jenoff's article in the New York Times? I thought this was really interesting. She teaches law, and she tells her students are like, oh, I want to write, but everything I write is just terrible. And she told them to go to her Goodreads page and look at the bad reviews. And she's like, see, like, just write, like, look at those, and you'll see that it's just you can't worry about that kind of thing. You just have to write and do what you love, write what you love, and the rest, hopefully. Also get a critique group.
I was just going to say, you have a great critique group too, and they recently all dressed up as Chanel and surprised you, right?
They did. I was totally surprised. We usually do a party, when someone has a book come out, we get together at a restaurant and have a big party. And of course we can't do that now. So we were, they told me, oh, we'll do that in March. And then we had our regular critique group Zoom meeting. We've been doing it by Zoom, and I had all the papers ready to go. And then they coordinated with my husband, and he came up with like a bottle of champagne, and they're all dressed in Chanel costumes, and it was just very cute, very big surprise. I was totally shocked.
But it does seem like that's been helpful for you too. Like, it's a great group. You all learn from each other, a lot of good feedback before you're even kind of to the process of turning it into anyone.
Oh yeah. I mean, I would never have gotten anything published if it wasn't for the critique. And for those in Houston, it started through a class at Imprint. I think 3 of us who are still in it originally took a class there on the novel. And that was over 16 years ago. And we've been meeting ever since and have incorporated other members. But I think it's hard to write in a vacuum, and you think you're communicating something that you're not actually communicating, but you don't realize it until, your whole writing group goes, oh, that's what you're trying to say? I didn't. Or they can tell you, this part's kind of slow, you might want to cut a little bit of that. Or a lot of times they say, wait, we want more, we want to know more about this. But it's just, I couldn't write without feedback. So if it's a writing group, or if it's just critique partners, having beta readers, I think is just really, it's helped me a lot, and it toughens you up, which is good, because if you do get published, you need to have a thick skin. And
no, I think that's true. That's so funny that you said that, because I just was beta reading a friend's novel, and it takes place in the Philippines. And I just was not familiar with that part of the World War II and what was happening, the geography. And that was kind of, it was helpful for me. Same thing for her. You get so involved in something you're writing that you don't kind of sit outside of it. And the book is fabulous. But I was like, but I'm a little confused about some of these locations, and a map would be helpful. So you kind of get so involved in your own work that someone else to kind of take a step back for you really helps.
Yes, you do. Totally. I was trying to think of an example, but we had one person in our writing group who's writing about a hospital, a Civil War hospital. And we were like, this is just too pretty. This is, you want blood, gore, I think we said maggots came up. We were all, it's just, you'd find strangest things, but it's really helpful to guide you as to making sure you're saying what you think you're saying, and what people don't understand that you think is so obvious. And then they live in your head as voices, and you can never get away from them. They're always there.
Do your characters speak to you? Because that's another interesting thing that I've had authors sometimes say, is that they feel like the characters speak to them. And that's just not something I can really relate to. Does that happen to you?
It has sometimes. Yes. So in the book, there were a few characters who pretty much wrote themselves, but unfortunately they were minor characters. There were major ones that would have been better. There were a few minor ones who I don't know where they came from. And then there's times where I do feel like someone's trying to tell me something. Unfortunately, it's not often, but I try to conjure them up and look up at the sky and say, please come and tell me what happens next. And sometimes, well, usually they don't come, but then I'll just write and it works out. But I've had some experiences where I'll have dialogue and I'm really stuck on the dialogue and I can't figure out, like, what is wrong with this? And then it'll occur to me that I need to the wrong people are talking, and you just switch the person talking and it works. But I'm not one of those who has someone living in my head, I think, as some authors say that they do.
Yeah, I just find that fascinating because I can't even imagine that. Do you have a set routine? Like when you're writing, do you write 2 hours a day or, 6 hours a day, or do you get a certain number of words down? Do you have how does that work for you?
I don't. I wish I did, but I don't. I just try to write whenever I can fit it in. Usually it's at night. I know there's a lot of authors who wake up early in the morning. Like I encountered some that were telling me how they get up at 4 a.m. every morning, and I could never. I would just be sitting there sleeping, staring at the computer screen, getting nothing done. But no, I don't have. I know a lot of authors treat it as a job, but I don't. I cannot do that. I can't. To me, it's like supposed to be my fun thing to do. So if I treated it like that, I don't think I'd want to do it as much. So I think it just depends on the author and what works for the individual person.
Do you find yourself at the grocery store or running an errand and all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, and you're like jotting down something or making notes about something you're working on?
Not usually at the grocery stores, but usually after I've gone to bed and turned the light off, and then everything, and I'm so tired, and then I get all these, the perfect line, and I know, I'm sure this happens to everybody, but you're not going to remember it in the morning, no matter how hard you try to tell yourself you will. So I've started, because I always have my phone by me, so I've started texting myself things. So I don't have to find paper or pen. I can just text it. And then the trick is remembering the next day that I actually texted myself something.
Or what it means, right? That seemed like the best idea, but now I read it and I'm like, what in the heck is this? So I sometimes find that even not writing a book, but having ideas or something I want to do the next day. And then I look at it and I'm like, I don't even know what that means.
Oh yeah, I have terrible handwriting. So the texting works out better too, because a lot of times I can't read what I wrote to myself at all.
Well, and I also think like if you don't have such a set schedule, you can kind of write when you're feeling like writing, like the story's coming to you and it's easy to sort of get it out then, versus it would be hard for me, I think, if I just said, okay, from 8 to 10 every day, this is what I'm going to do, because sometimes I wouldn't be in the mood to do that. And then I would have just put undue pressure on myself.
Yeah, I don't know. I need to find a way to be more disciplined, and sometimes I find myself getting sucked into like a TV show or something and then I sit there and I'm like, why am I doing this? Watching this stupid show when I should be being productive. So I do, I need to try to be more organized, I think, a little bit. I have changed my research process, which for my first book was I researched as I went along. And I thought that was the way to do it because, I'm living in the moment in the research and then in the story. And I had read that Philippa Gregory, she had written that she basically gets like a BA in whatever her topic is before she starts writing.
Oh.
Everything. Yeah. And I thought, I could never do it that way, that I'd forget it all. And so when I started writing the Chanel Sisters, I realized, actually kind of after I finished the Chanel Sisters, now on book 3, I realized, okay, I've got to get more organized. So for this next book, I researched first, which is different. And now writing with having had the research done, which I have to say, I think is the better way to go. Just because you can find things. Like I've been very careful about being able to find things so I don't have to spend an hour trying to find the book that I know where they said such and such.
Well, that's true. If you kind of organize it in a notebook or something, and then you're thinking, okay, I need this portion. And then you just have to still, I'm sure, oh, wait, well, what would they wear now? Or I didn't think about this little part. And you still probably have a little bit of research to do, but nothing like, okay, I need to tackle this entire area.
Yeah. And I think it's good to give you a sense of the time period and the sense of the characters. And I don't know. I like I said before, I think every person has their own process, and what works for one person doesn't work for another, and it can still be evolving for everybody as they move forward.
Well, that's been the interesting thing to me with my podcast is that there are so many different ways that people do it. Like I would have never, when I talk to people about their writing habits or, the way their research, all of it is that, everybody just kind of comes up with what works for them. And it's, pulls from different, like you, Philippa Gregory, pulling from different people's ideas over time, trying to figure out what works best for you, but still kind of finding your own. And then do you have a lot of research that you don't end up using? Do you kind of put it aside and hope that will work for you for another book, or how does that work?
I have a lot of research that I don't end up using. I mean, I'll write a lot of scenes that I don't end up using. So I think, I don't know, someone should do the statistics. If I were a math person, maybe I could figure it out. But I mean, there's a lot that's written that doesn't, that ends up on the cutting room floor. I'm sure you've heard of the phrase "kill your darlings." Which is where writers, we'll write something that we think is so beautiful and poignant, and then you go to the critique group or the editor group, like, right. This is not, what is this in here for? And you're like, because it's beautiful. I'm like, well, it's not moving the story along, but it's beautiful. And then, they're like, no, cut it. So that's killing your darlings. And so, when you're just sitting there writing, a lot of stuff comes out and it's not always, exactly. And that's why, if you want to write, you just got to write and realize that you may not use everything. And like you said before, it doesn't have to be perfect.
Well, and I think, people, I've also heard several authors say this, and I'd never heard it before, when they're killing their darlings, that they put it in a file somewhere so that, maybe later they say, oh, actually, that works beautifully in the story. I mean, not the exact same bit of it, but the idea, the language, that you're not kind of reinventing the wheel.
Oh, yeah, I do that for sure. I mean, I definitely have a separate file. Because the last thing you want to do is have to start to write something from scratch all over again that you already wrote. So I do keep all that stuff in case I ever need to, and in case I find a place for it where it actually will work and move the story forward instead of just taking up useless space.
Okay, good. Well, it looks like McKenna has some questions. So maybe we can hear from some of the audience members.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Okay, all right, great. So we do have some questions. I actually have this little fancy feature where I can pop them up on the screen. So here we go. The first question is from Anne Weisgarber, another wonderful author of historical fiction. She was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the sisters' parents.
About the sisters' parents? Yes, well, so they were, like I said before, they were not married. They were very poor. They were, the father in particular, Albert Chanel, was a traveling peddler, and his parents were traveling peddlers. They never really had a home, so they were basically vagabonds. And he went from market to market, and he was supposedly he was very charming, and you can kind of see a little bit of this in Coco too, where he had black hair and he could charm people, and he sold women's underthings. I mean, he sold whatever he could possibly sell, and he had a woman in every town, I think. He was kind of a rake, and then the mother was a laundress or whatever she had to do to try to put food on the table for the girls. Coco thought that she was his favorite, supposedly. So it hurt her in particular when he abandoned them. When the mother died, he left them at the convent and never returned. They never saw him again for the rest of their lives. Didn't hear from him. I mean, who knows what happened to him? And it's funny because some people say, the only thing that Coco got from her father was his name. So the name Chanel, comes from this guy who abandoned her and left her as a charity case. But he came from a really large family. And then his youngest sister, Adrienne, he was the oldest, she was the youngest. She was just a year older than Coco. And she became kind of a mentor to Coco and Antoinette in their lives. She was, poor as well, but she, for some reason, just knew how to maybe work it or something. I don't know. She had a lot of confidence and helped guide the girls to be confident themselves, which is also in the story. But the parents aren't I think their absence is their biggest role in the story.
All right, so we have another question. This one's from Denise, and she has a follow-up, but we'll do this one first. What did you find most intriguing while researching for this story?
Well, there was a lot that was really intriguing. I think, one thing authors do is we try, we need to know what our characters want from the very beginning. And I think trying to figure out what they wanted, what did they really want, was interesting to me to explore that through their history and their actions. And I think in the end, I think they wanted what most people want, and that is just, really to be loved, to be accepted. And they were born into poverty, and in France at that time, there were very few ways for women to get out of poverty. It wasn't like today. What Coco did was extremely unusual for her time. And there was the theater, women could go into the theater or they could become a mistress, women from their class. And there wasn't really any other path to becoming rich. They couldn't, marrying well was not an option because people really married more as business deals than for love. And, that's not a business deal if you're marrying someone who has no money. So I thought that was intriguing, just really kind of learning the psychology behind their characters and the time frame and what it was they wanted and how that manifested itself in the clothing that Coco ended up making that had this freedom of movement.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I'm going to move away from Denise's questions for just a second, and we'll take one from Deborah. She has a couple also, but as I'm sitting here looking at my Chanel powder compact, I think her question is perfect. Explain the development of the accessories. So essentially, she was wondering why pearls and purses. How did those come about?
Well, the pearls were. Supposedly the pearls were something that these mistresses got from their lovers. So from what I've read, there were a lot of what they called courtesans, and they were very famous at the time. And these were women who came from poor backgrounds, but they were beautiful or alluring, and they were kind of celebrities, even though they weren't accepted by society at all. They were never married. Some of them got married later in life, but they weren't accepted. I remember reading about one of them who died, and everybody went to, I guess they sold everything in her apartment. All the society women went, to see like what was there, but they never would have spoken to her in person or in real life. But so these women wore pearls that were gifts from their lovers. And it was, the more pearls you wore, the more valued you were, the more money you had. It was kind of like their retirement 401k that they wore around their neck. And when Coco was living with Etienne Balsan, he actually had one of these great courtesans was his lover. And then Coco came in and was kind of in second place. But this woman, Coco was really intrigued by her. She wore layers and layers of pearls and had all kinds of jewels. So she incorporated those pearls into her own style. And I think it's interesting too, because how she's known for saying every woman, you should look in the mirror and take off one thing. I don't think she ever did that. Because if you look at pictures of her, like she's covered in, jewelry.
You don't know what she started with though.
Yeah, true.
We have a couple questions that people had asked, like what is the most enjoyable aspect of writing for you? But you already answered that. You said your writing. So I'm going to move on from there. Denise had another question here. Did your characters take you in a different direction than you originally planned?
That's a good question. Well, okay. I guess they did and they didn't. I mean, it's historical fiction, so I know what happens. In certain parts, I know things that are going to happen at different times. So the big picture, no, because I can't change the big picture. But I think in kind of developing what it was that they were seeking in life. That did evolve a bit in the story as I wrote it. I didn't write it knowing exactly what was going to happen as I was writing. So I think, I did go in some directions I didn't totally expect to go in for some of it. I mean, in historical fiction too, we think we know everything that happened, but we don't know everything that happened. And it's probably a lot different there's a lot more to it than we see in retrospect.
Right. We have another question from Justine. She was wondering if you've ever been to Paris, and did you get to do any research there? And then more about your travels if you did.
I have been to Paris several times, and I studied there when I did, a study abroad program, and lived in Paris and went to school there for a little while. So I felt pretty comfortable with Paris and Parisians and the location. I've been to the south of France. So I felt comfortable with that part. I wish I could have gone to the Abbey in Aubazine, the convent orphanage. I've not gone there except online. And in fact, it's funny because they're following me now on Instagram and Facebook. And they have like a cat. You have to follow them because it's the same Abbey. It's not a convent orphanage anymore, but it's beautiful. It's out in the middle of nowhere. I would love to go there, but it's supposedly really hard to get to. But they have a little cat that's called Chanel, CHA, and then Chanel. And then they take pictures of it as it roams around. Anyway, I'm not even a cat person, but I think it's really cute. And I did even, so for Mulan, I have not been to Mulan, and I wanted to find the pensionnat where they lived. So I got on Google Earth and actually walked around the streets of Mulan from my computer, and I knew kind of where the pensionnat was, but there's no address for it or anything. It was kind of frustrating. And I was just walking along, and all of a sudden I came upon the door that said Pensionnat Notre Dame, which was the door. And so I was like super excited, and then walked around to see, where Coco would have walked. And so I think that's kind of cheating. I wasn't there. I would like to go there, but I was there sort of.
I would be so excited if I was walking around Google Earth and I came across that door. That sounds like a great moment. Mm-hmm. So we have another question from Deborah. She was wondering, not specifically your book, but in the history of Chanel, why was it just famed for Coco as opposed to the Chanel sisters?
Why was it what?
Fame for Coco instead of the sisters.
Well, the sisters ended up going their own way earlier in Coco's life. And so Coco was a person who, I think, the past was always very painful for her. I think that's part of why she denied her past. I don't think it was because, some people say, she was embarrassed because she was so poor. I think she was actually embarrassed because she was abandoned by her father, because the story she made up that she was raised by aunts in the countryside was still not a glamorous story. But the past was very painful. And I think when the past to her was the past, and she was always looking forward and not looking back. And she just didn't go there. And she really became famous after Antoinette left the picture and didn't talk about her, and nobody really knew about her, and she just kind of got, forgotten. And there's a lot of forgotten people. I mean, look at all the great books that are coming out about all these people. There's just so many people who've done so much that we don't know about.
Yeah, absolutely. I see there were a couple more questions, but I wanted to take just a minute to say that we do have signed copies of Chanel Sisters. Judy stopped by the store a couple days ago, so we have some signed paperbacks available. If you'd like, I've dropped a link already in the comments for ordering. I know a bunch of you already have purchased it, and we appreciate that. I also want to give a shout out again to Conversations from a Page and Cindy's podcast, Thoughts from a Page. I believe that Judy is on there, correct? I'll have another one. Perfect. So I have also put links in there to find out more about conversations from her page, her wonderful literary salon series, which is now virtual, and you can read more about and join, as well as a link to her podcast where she discusses with all sorts of authors their latest books and what they're enjoying reading. So I would highly recommend taking a minute to check that out. So let's see, more questions. Absolutely, Cindy. My pleasure. And thank you again for being a guest host tonight. It takes one event off my plate, and obviously you've done a wonderful job. So let's see. Sharon was wondering, of the many products that Chanel has, what did you enjoy learning about the most?
Ooh, that's another good question. I guess it would be the clothing, because learning about that it came from the that so much of it derives, her aesthetic derives from the convent. Although even the perfume doesn't happen until after the book ends. That she did that a little bit, actually kind of right around 1921. But that was really interesting. There's a quote from her, and I wish I had it with me, but I'm not going to remember it very well. But it was something about, she's known for saying, you probably heard her say that, women should wear perfume. She's the kind of adamant about this perfume thing. And, now we don't really wear, I don't think, a lot of perfume like they did. But there's some quote about how she basically says that people don't realize that smelling good is a luxury. And the way she said it was like from her past, like she came from poverty and it was kind of like everything smelled bad, like you don't know what it's like. And when she was taken in by the nuns at the convent, I think that's why it impressed her so much, because her life changed completely. She was 11 years old, and she went from living a very chaotic life where she didn't know, where her next meal would come from, probably dirty, not very well educated, to going into this life with nuns where everything was ordered, everything had to be clean. And I think she recognized that saved her in a way, and that it saved her from the fate of her mother. And that's why she incorporated, whether consciously or subconsciously, those designs into her clothing. And the perfume, I mean, she supposedly just hated bad smells, was just a nut. Like, you'd walk into the boutique and it would smell like perfume. And I think when she first was starting the Chanel No. 5, she was at a restaurant in the south of France where she had just gotten some samples and was just spraying it around the table as people were walking by. She was just kind of a nut for good smells. And I think that came from her past.
Well, it must have been, if you grow up never smelling anything wonderful and you're given that option, I'd probably surround myself with perfume constantly too. I mean, that sounds reasonable. I also will say, just as someone listening to this conversation, the connection between the convent and her suits, that's kind of mind blowing for this brand to have such a just top, highest end possible luxury idea as a Chanel suit, and that it could be inspired by nuns. That kind of blew my mind. So anyway, that's fascinating.
I should have mentioned this before, but the nuns wore their rosaries around their waists.
Oh, that's right.
Belts.
Wow.
And they would hang down a little bit. And so if you compare those to her chain link belts and her chain link bags, they're so similar. Like, I mean,
yeah, that's just, I mean, it makes sense when you put it that way, but who would have ever thought? That's incredible.
The interlocking C's. I mean, I just think that's what you think of when you think of Chanel, and the fact that came from the orphanage window. I mean, that's just amazing to me. I thought that was so fascinating. I've talked with Judy about it so many times, because it's just kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of the interlocking C's and the name Coco, Anne also was wondering if you could talk about the name Coco.
Well, her given name was Gabrielle. And so for most of, she said, so she lied about where Coco came from. Well, we think it's a lie. I guess we don't know for sure. But so she said that Coco was a pet name that her father gave her. Because again, she liked to think she was his favorite, which I think was another reason why it devastated her more that he left. But so she told people that's where Coco came from. But the biographers all are pretty much in agreement that when she left the pensionnat in Moulin, she was still Gabrielle, and she wanted to make something of herself. She didn't necessarily want to be accepted by society, but she wanted to be adored, and she wanted to be independent, financially independent. So she tried to be a singer and a dancer, and she started singing at a kind of cafe in Moulin that the soldiers went to. There was a garrison there, and for the cavalry officers. And so she went and she sang 2 songs, and one of them was about Coco at the Chocadero, which was a song about a little lost dog named Coco. And so she would sing that and do this little dance. And eventually she became known as Coco, and supposedly the officers would all pound on the tables and yell, Coco, 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 for her to come out on stage. And there was another one, I can't even pronounce it, but it also has Coco in the title. So those kind of became her signature pieces, and that's how she got the Coco nickname. But she told everybody it was a pet name from her father because she didn't really talk about her past as a singer with anybody either. She kind of tried to forget about that part of her life.
Yeah, great. Okay, our last question from the crowd is, Melanie was wondering, what do you think was her most brilliant clothing invention?
Oh, well, of course, she invented the little black dress. That's outside of the book too. It'll be in book number 3, but it's after book number 2. But I think just in general, it's really amazing. Her philosophy of clothing is really what's amazing. Just the clothes that she first designed were made to move in, and she completely liberated women. There were others who had, gotten rid of the corset. There was others who cut their hair, but she was unique in that people actually wanted to look like her. I mean, I think a few women might have cut their hair, but nobody else was like, oh, I want to do that too. But she did it, and she could carry it off. But she really changed the way women live their lives. And she, women dressed in costumes pretty much. I mean, they didn't dress. I like to think her philosophy was that a woman should dress to live and not live to dress. And she gave women clothing to where they could wake up in the morning and you don't have to think about what you're going to put on, and you don't need help getting dressed. A lot of those women couldn't even dress themselves because it was so complicated. And you just put on, this uniform, and you look good, and you go out and you live. She played a lot of tennis. She played golf. She rode horses. She was very active, and she wanted clothing that worked for that lifestyle.
Yeah, and that was kind of her revolutionary mindset that launched it all, really. I would think, having read this much about her, that her impact for sure. Okay, well, I think we've reached the time to conclude this talk. I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I know people in the comments have been enjoying it, raving about the book, can't wait to read the book, all good things. So Judith, I want to thank you for joining us this evening, and congratulations on the publication. Also, Cindy, as I've said, thank you. We really appreciate you joining us. Okay. So everyone who's watching, have a wonderful evening, and you two ladies especially, thanks again, and good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, McKenna, for having me.
Yeah, thanks.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.